This is the Žižek Dictionary entry for Althusser by Geoffrey Pfeifer. The work of French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, born 1918, died 1990, is important for Žižek in a variety of ways. This is most apparent in Žižek's conception of ideology, as it is at least partially against the backdrop of Althusser's own conception of ideology that Žižek is constructed. In order to see this relationship, we should first say a bit about Althusser's conception of ideology. Althusser rejects the traditional Marxist conception of ideology as a kind of simple false consciousness that can be completely overcome or set right by proper Marxist analysis. Rather, for Althusser, ideology is always in operation in our subjective awareness. That is, as Althusser puts it for Marx, all consciousness is ideological. According to Althusser, even though particular historical ideological forms come into being and pass away, much like the Lacanian concept of the symbolic, the structure of ideology is an ever-present feature of conscious life. His theory of interpellation, given in the famous piece entitled Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Notes Toward an Investigation, is meant to further expand on and explain this point. In this essay, Althusser distinguishes between what he calls repressive state apparatuses, or RSAs, which are those parts of the state, including the state itself, that function to enforce the domination of the ruling class through violence. Here, Althusser cites institutions such as the prisons, law, the courts, the police, and the military, and what he calls the ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs, which have the same function, to enforce the domination of the ruling class, but operate differently. ISAs work not through violence, but through the reproduction of a given set of historical ideologies. Some of the examples of ISAs that Althusser provides are schools, churches, trade unions, familial structures, and other cultural institutions, practices, and traditions. In the ISA, ideology itself takes a material form. We are, claims Althusser, immersed in ideology because it is materially represented in the multitude of institutions and practices that we engage in and are engaged by. How do the ISAs enforce ideological structures? Althusser's answer is that they do this through what he calls interpellation. According to Althusser, one is interpellated or hailed by an ISA when one recognizes oneself as the subject of the ISA's call, or as the one who is being hailed. His example is the policeman who hails a passerby on the street by saying, "Hey, you there." It is turning around and responding to the hail that one becomes a subject of the call, and is thus interpellated by the hail. This is because, as Althusser points out, one has recognized that the hail was really addressed to him, and that it was really him who was hailed, and not someone else. We are, argues Althusser, always in a state of being interpellated in this way. When one goes to church, one is interpellated by a particular set of religious practices, to be the subject of such practices. When one goes shopping, one is interpellated by the practices that are a part of shopping, to be a subject that shops. When one walks onto the university campus, one is interpellated by the university to be a particular kind of subject, a student or a teacher or an administrator, etc., and so on. By engaging in any material social practice or with any material institution, we admit, unconsciously, that we are the subject of such a practice, and in doing this, we become the kind of subject that engages in that practice and thus are constituted by it. Furthermore, the recognition of oneself as a subject of ideology is not just the recognition of oneself as such a subject at that moment. Rather, one recognizes or misrecognizes oneself as always having been such a subject. This is an important point. When I am interpolated and I recognize myself as the one being hailed, included in that recognition is the misrecognition that I have always already been the subject that is subjected to such practices and is beholden to them. Althusser points out here that ideology has always already interpolated individuals as subjects, which amounts to making it clear that individuals are always already interpolated by ideology as subjects, which necessarily leads us to one last proposition. Individuals are always already subjects. Returning then to the point above about the ever-present nature of ideology, not only is it the case that since we are constantly in a process of being interpolated, we are always already subjects. Althusser also argues that, although ideological practices may differ at different historical times and places, the structure of interpolation is ever present. This is what is meant by his claim that ideology has no history. We always find ourselves interpolated as subjects by the material institutions, traditions, and practices that exist for us at a given time and place. And while these change, the process of our constitution by them remains stable. Though Žižek takes much from Althusser, and he partially agrees with Althusser regarding the latter's claims about subjective constitution out of the communal social material, the ISAs and their process of interpolation, Žižek wants to claim that the ISAs are not material in quite the way that Althusser envisions them to be. Further, Žižek thinks that, although subjectivity as interpolated can and does often act as a site for the reproduction of existing class divisions and power structures, it is not solely subordinated to his logic as Althusser argues. On Žižek's revision of the Althusserian view, it only appears to subjects themselves that they are constituted in this way. In explaining this, Žižek invokes the Lacanian concept of the big other, what in this context we might liken to the particular totality of ISAs that exist at a given time. With Lacan's big other, the perspective is completely the opposite. The very positing of the big other is a subjective gesture. That is, the big other is a virtual entity that exists only through the subject's presupposition. This moment is missing in Althusser's notion of the ideological state apparatuses, with its emphasis on the materiality of the big other. Its material existence in ideological institutions and ritualized practices, Lacan's big other is, on the contrary, ultimately virtual and, as such, in its most basic dimension, immaterial. The view that there is such a totality of ISAs which are both external to the subject and inescapable is itself the result of the interpolative process, insofar as this is placed on the world by consciousness as interpolated. Althusser misses this, according to Žižek, because of his belief in the external as material nature of the ISA and its power of interpolation. He does not sufficiently recognize what Žižek sees as a dialectical reduplication inherent to the interpolative process, and ultimately to the material existence of the ISA itself. A brief discussion of Žižek's reading of Hegel's thought, to enlist another of Žižek's intellectual touchstones, regarding habituation should be helpful in making sense of this. As Žižek argues, Habituation is, for Hegel, the means whereby what is external, the Althusserian ISA, for instance, becomes internalized in such a way as to constitute the individual's awareness in interpolation, and then is redeployed by that individual as that through which the world is comprehended, structured, and organized. The world appears to us in the way that it does as a result of such an activity, which is itself a reduplication of that which first constructs this activity. The conclusion to be drawn is thus that the only way to account for the distinction between the inside and outside, constitutive of a living organism, is to posit a kind of self-reflexive reversal by means of which, to put it in Hegelese, the one of an organism as a whole retroactively posits as its result as that which dominates and regulates the set of its own causes, for example, the very multiple processes out of which it emerged. In interpolation, I am, pace Althusser, subjected to the materially existing practices and structures of my socio-historical community, which are then reduplicated in me as the inner structure of my subjectivity. In habituation, I internalize these practices. What I am is the internalization of them, and at the same time the inner is then thrust back onto the world, and is what acts as the virtual or immaterial limit of the world itself. In other words, I experience this limit set by me in my subjective, conceptual presuppositions, which posit the existence of the big other as an externally imposed limit. In this way, my own positing activity becomes that which limits me, and my conception of my world without my knowing it. Žižek continues, in this way, and only in this way, an organism is no longer limited by external conditions, but is fundamentally self-limited. Again, as Hegel would have articulated it, life emerges when the external limitation of an entity by its environs turns into self-limitation. Put concisely, the Althusserian ISA is, as Žižek argues, not that which is external to me and limits my subjectivity, as Althusser understands it, but is rather that internalized externality that becomes a virtualized subjective positing or presupposition through which I limit myself, and thereby also limit my world. In this reduplication, I limit myself but experience this limitation as coming from the world. The ISA is, for me, external to my existence. I do not comprehend it as emanating from me, or, more precisely, being supported and propped up by my recognition of myself as its subject in interpolation. So ultimately, for Žižek, the ISAs themselves do in fact operate in the ways that Althusser has described. They are mechanisms of interpolation, but their material existence hinges on the very subjects they interpolate, insofar as subjects act as their support.